I have joined the Scott Boren Club of finishing the book. And the book that I'm finishing, for those on live stream, is Windows on the World of Jesus, Time Travel to Ancient Judea. So we're looking at just the culture surrounding the time when Jesus was alive and slightly after. So the chapter that I was working on was common values. And this chapter was looking a lot at the idea of, particularly at work, in work settings, what sort of values were expected, what was valued in general in the culture, but in particular in work settings. So there's a lot to unpack here. It was, I think, about 40 pages of content. So we're going to try and look at a couple of main points and then maybe develop a couple of those. So one of the first really big main points was the idea of becoming indispensable. That was something that was really valued in this ancient Mediterranean culture, in the first century Mediterranean culture, was this idea that where you are in your work, you don't want this to be a position anybody else could fill. So you're not going to take somebody who's like just a little bit directly under you and train them up and teach them how to do your job, because then they could usurp your job. And it was very, you were very protective of your role. The idea was sort of similar to how in a family unit, everybody in the family unit kind of belongs in the family unit, and everybody kind of has their role. In the work units, it was expected that you weren't just going to get rid of people or change careers. If you were the butcher in your village, you would remain the butcher in your village continuously. And so with that, there was kind of a very strong sense of wanting to belong and wanting to fit well in your role, continue in your role, and have a place where you know that you're secure. And one of the connections that the book made with this was the idea of the body of Christ, and that with the analogy we've heard of the body of Christ, that one person might be an eye, one person might be an arm, one person might be a hand. The idea is that everybody has a role specific to them and must be there in order for everything to fully function. And so that would have been a really appealing idea in that culture, that idea of being able to fully function in your particular role. And so with that, there was a very strong emphasis on never admitting ignorance related to your role. The example in the book was this idea of a American bringing a car to a mechanic, a Mediterranean mechanic, and saying, "Do you know how to work on this type of car?" And the mechanic saying, "Of course I do." Only come to find out he doesn't know how to work on the car. Kind of this idea that if he were to admit that he didn't know how to do something related to being a mechanic, then he's not fit to be a mechanic, and he's replaceable in that role. So he would never want to admit that he doesn't know how to do something related to his role. And when I was reading through that, I was really thinking about what we've talked about for the last several years, just as a church community, the idea of saying, "I don't know," and how hard it can be sometimes to admit when we're not sure of things, to admit when we don't know what position is right. Particularly, we've talked about this related to religious issues, but even aside from that, that it's very difficult to admit when we're ignorant. And so in that way, we're not so different from this culture of being afraid that if we admit that we don't know something, we're not fit to be in whatever role we are. I think we kind of have that fear sometimes where we don't want to let anybody know how ignorant we are, even when we know we don't have a firm grasp of the concepts. So that was kind of the first really big overarching idea, was just this idea of being fit in your role and being indispensable in it. And the next really kind of broad overarching idea was the idea that in this culture, you don't want to make mistakes. It's a really big idea that you don't want to commit any serious errors. If you're going to be promoted in your role or in your job, if you're going to do well and thrive, it's not about all the things you accomplish. It's about staying in your role for a long time without any serious errors. And it's not so much about what initiative you take, it's about your lack of mistakes. So with that, I have one of the windows to read. This is window 50 for anybody playing along at home. And it says that after working in Jerusalem for 2 months in a Mediterranean Judean organization, Bill Barton decided to make some suggestions to the Mediterranean Judean who was in charge. He talked about how effective American supervisors had found the brainstorming technique for getting new ideas. Bill explained that a number of people would get together and the problem or topic of discussion would be introduced. Then everyone would give whatever suggestions came to mind, and the best ideas would then be utilized. The Mediterranean Judean supervisors seemed rather hesitant, but since Bill was supposed to be an expert advisor, the supervisor set up a brainstorming session with his Mediterranean Judean subordinates in executive positions. All the men got together at 2 o'clock the next afternoon, and they began with a consideration of the problems facing the company. Then they were told to reflect upon the problems and to volunteer their opinions concerning the best way to deal with the problems. It became obvious from the long periods of prolonged silence that the process just wouldn't work. No local executive really volunteered anything. Why did the brainstorming session fail? So, kind of the answer that's given throughout this is that the brainstorming session failed because these people in these roles didn't want to volunteer information, didn't want to take initiative, because then they're liable if something goes wrong. It's not really valued in that culture to take initiative or to really change the status quo. It's better to kind of stay in your lane and not risk making a mistake, because in that culture, making a mistake has pretty serious repercussions to, as we talked about before, your honor. And that maintaining your honor isn't so much about all the grand things you do, it's about all the mistakes you don't do, and kind of the amount of time you can go without making particularly serious errors. So everybody in this culture, generally, are trying to avoid responsibility. Not responsibility for their duties or their obligations, but responsibility for any significant decisions or choices that they make. One of the examples throughout the book with that is the idea of stoning, and the idea of large groups of people throwing stones as a way of executing somebody. In that way, if a whole group of people is stoning somebody, then no one person in that group is responsible for the death of that person. By stoning as a group, by having a mob of people all contributing to the death of the person they're trying to kill, they all kind of avoid the major responsibility of, I did that. And so if something comes out where, for whatever reason, it's decided that that person should not have died, it's a whole group of people who are responsible. It's not any one person. We also kind of see that in the way things are talked about. We see that throughout the Gospels, they'll say things like, and the crowd went up to Jesus and they said this. Crowds will go up to Jesus, and the way it's recorded is as if everybody puts forth an idea. So that's kind of similar to this idea of if you have this whole group of people and they're all expressing an idea or all committing an action, everybody separately can kind of avoid some of the responsibility and risk to their honor. And in some ways, that's not so different from how we are in our culture when it comes to how we behave in groups. There have been various studies that show, like, sometimes they've had things like staging a child being kidnapped to see how people will react. And what you'll find is that everybody in the group feels like this isn't right, feels like this is a problem, but nobody stands up because they're worried, what if I make a mistake? What if this person is just a kid throwing a tantrum and I'm overreacting? What if I'm wrong in this assessment? And so nobody will necessarily step forward to help right away because they're worried that by taking that risk or that initiative, that they'll be perceived by the group as committing a pretty serious error. And then oftentimes once one person does stand up, everybody else starts to stand up too because they feel like, okay, I'm not the first person, I'm not the only one if it is an error, I'm not the only one making it, and so feel a little more confident in taking that initiative. We also kind of see this with Pontius Pilate. We see that he, when Christ is brought to him, he kind of asks the crowd, what should we do with him? Should we kill Christ? Should we kill Barabbas, the thief? And sort of lets the crowd decide, and then washes his hands of it. Like, I didn't make any decision, the crowd made the decision. I didn't do it. And that would have been a very common attitude in that time, that you don't want to be the one who made the final decision if you might be wrong. So if you can pass off, I'm just doing what the crowd asked me to do, I washed my hands of it, that would be a pretty common way to approach that problem in this culture. Basically, you're trying to, if you look at honor, as we've talked about a little bit like a barometer, we're kind of American culture and first century Mediterranean culture. Both of them, you have to fulfill your obligations. But in the first century Mediterranean culture, it's better to just fulfill your obligations and kind of stay in this range. Whereas with Americans, it's better to reach high and try and succeed and try to do better and try to take on big projects. And it's okay if you make some mistakes along the way. So because we have that in our culture, we expect some mistakes to happen, and mistakes are seen as things to work past, things to learn from, things to move on from. We're a lot more comfortable risking making mistakes for the possibility of rising higher. Whereas in this culture, it's better not to risk those mistakes. It's better to kind of stay where you're secure and stay just fulfilling your duties and your obligations and your role. So a way we could look at this is religiously. If we're to think, who is the best Christian that you can think of right now? We'll all have different responses to that, but some responses might be somebody who's done something really great. Somebody something like, the example that comes to my mind is, I think a lot of people would answer something like Mother Teresa, who's going out and feeding people and clothing people and being with sick people and really going above and beyond the call of duty. Whereas the impression I got, at least from reading the book, that the most religious people that would be thought of in that culture would be the people who have led a blameless life. Not the people who have achieved something great or done some great project, but people who have gone without sin, who have followed the law. We see that a lot in the Pharisees and the Sadducees, people who really prize that I followed the law my entire life. That in that culture, that's better. It's better to follow the law your entire life and hit all your obligations than to do some great things and some mistakes. Just this idea of being blameless. And so that kind of got me thinking a little bit, and I thought about if we are in a culture that, in general, at least compared to this culture, we're okay with big mistakes and big triumphs, a lot bigger range of that, how does that affect us? And the example that came to my mind was the idea of, well, I had a salad for lunch, so I can eat one of the donuts that are in the break room. You know, I did something good, so it's okay if some other thing isn't good. Or I ate a donut in the break room, so I'll have a salad for lunch and it'll balance out. Either we mess up and then we try and compensate, or we do something well, and then it's okay if we mess up a little bit. And I wonder at times if we do this, not just in little things like salads and donuts and break rooms, but also in our relationships. And I know I have at times when I get in a big fight, things I don't mean, and I don't approach things diplomatically, but then I do something really nice for somebody else. And I feel like it's okay, I'm a good person. Like, I almost feel like by doing some good thing for somebody, it doesn't really matter that I did this other thing that really hurt somebody else.
Balancing the scales.
Yeah, balancing the scales. I wonder if we have a tendency in our culture to justify our mistakes by our triumphs. I kind of got the impression from the reading that in this culture, triumphs didn't balance out mistakes quite so easily. And I would say that somewhere in between is probably the ideal spot, but I think it's just worth considering the idea that maybe we should try a little bit more to still achieve and do good things, but also to not use that to justify when we made mistakes, and to own up to our mistakes to others, but also to ourselves, and not to try and tell ourselves it's all okay. So that's a little bit of fun for your day. Another big idea with this idea of not wanting to make mistakes and not taking initiative is the idea that for the most part, in these roles people were in the first century Mediterranean culture, you're not trying to get ahead. You're not trying to gain status. You're trying to maintain the status you were born into. There was a lot of the role you're born in is the role that you're born into, whether that be a gender role or a wealth role or a religious role. A lot of people did what their parents did. A lot of people kind of continued on the path, and while it's not that nobody ever rose above where they were or fell from where they were, the general mindset wasn't like we have that I'm going to have this great career and I'm going to do better than I ever had before, and I'm going to make money and gain status and do better, and then retire in a lovely yacht.
That's your dream.
Yeah.
Wow. Alrighty then.
Not my dream in particular, but I'm in the wrong field for that. But the idea of gaining and doing better and getting ahead and getting promoted and rising to the top, that wasn't so much the idea. The idea was more maintaining the status that you were at. So kind of in this culture, it's a little bit better to just not lose any of the honor your family has than it is to rise dramatically above where you were. And in particular, if you do rise dramatically above and you leave behind your in-group to do that, you leave behind other people that should be of big concern to you, then that's a real problem. So if you're going to rise ahead, you have to make sure that you're keeping your in-group with you, and that you're continuing to support your family group and your village and your in-group. So we've got a couple more ideas. The next kind of big one that stood out to me a lot is that in the work cultures of the first century Mediterranean culture, if somebody else is being inefficient, it's best to kind of overlook it. If somebody comes to you and they have their project halfway done, you don't say, well, we need the other half like really quick, and when are you going to have that other half done, and you should have been done by now. You compliment them on the half that they have done. And part of that is the fact that there wasn't quite the emphasis on getting things done quickly that we have in our culture. But part of it's just the idea that you need to be complimentary on what's done well, rather than being critical of what's not done well. And that kind of concept, we don't have that as much as it would be in the first century Mediterranean culture, but we're kind of on a bit of an upswing on that concept in our schools, actually, right now. It's becoming increasingly more popular. Several states are at 40% of the schools in that state have adopted this program called PBIS. And you probably drive past schools that have this program all the time. Obviously not every school, but more and more schools are adopting this every year. And the idea behind PBIS, it's Positive Behavior Intervention Strategy, is that you look for when kids are doing good, and you compliment them on what they're doing good, rather than complimenting kids on what they aren't doing well. So kind of the idea with that is if I've got a classroom of little kiddos and sitting up out of their seats, and I see little Susie in the front sitting down and little Patricia over here running around, I don't tell little Patricia to come sit in her seat right now. I tell little Susie, that's great, you're doing great sitting so nicely in your seat. And what's been found is that a lot of the times then little Patricia will come over and sit too, because she wants to be complimented too. So it's more using compliments than discipline. And that also means that if little Patricia is continually a problem, that I look for times when little Patricia is doing what she's supposed to, and I kind of heap on the praise then. And what's been found with that is the idea that if instead of always being the bad kid who's always getting in trouble, she's getting some praise and some encouragement, she'll want more of the praise and the encouragement rather than just giving up and I always get in trouble. So it's kind of in that way, this program that's being implemented into schools where more of an emphasis is put on building kids up and complimenting when they're doing well, kind of would fit well into this first century Mediterranean idea, that you don't look for what people are doing wrong. In the work culture, you look for what people are doing right. And if a project is half done, you praise them on the half that they did rather than nitpicking the half that they didn't. So kind of with that idea, I think that's one where we're kind of somewhere in the middle in our American culture, that we do nitpick a little bit more than would be acceptable in the Mediterranean culture, but there is kind of an upswing, especially in how we're dealing with this next generation of kids, of being positive and being really complimenting and accepting and kind of encouraging. So the last kind of big point is the idea that, and it kind of pulls back to the idea of never wanting to make mistakes. It pulls back to the idea of not nitpicking on other people's work, and it pulls back to the idea of becoming indispensable in your role, that you want to be the only one who can fill your role. It's this idea that work life in the first century Mediterranean culture is always personal. If I'm a supervisor and I talk to one of my subordinates and I criticize even what we would see as criticized very lightly, I'm not just criticizing their work, I'm criticizing who they are as a person. I'm criticizing them as a father, as a mother, as a son, as a daughter. I'm criticizing their entire identity. Not because work is their entire identity, but because there's no separation between their work life and their personal life. We've got a pretty decent separation between work life and personal life. I know we tease my dad that he has his work family and his work wife. That he kind of has this group and this connection and goes off and does his work things and then comes home and is the dad and the husband, and that he's
His private life.
yeah, his private life. He's ours when he's here, he's theirs when he's there. Simple. It wasn't. If I'm criticizing your work, I am criticizing you as a person. I'm very much, it's highly personal. And so that really got me thinking at how I don't think it's healthy to be on the extreme that the first century Mediterranean culture was, where every criticism of work is a criticism of the person. Some examples you can see of that is when people will criticize Jesus' disciples for picking grain on the Sabbath, or for healing on the Sabbath, or for not washing their hands properly. That was always a highly personal attack on their character and on Jesus' character, because they were his disciples. That was always seen as a personal attack. You can also see in some letters to Paul, or letters from Paul, he talks about things like people saying that his words sound nice, but his countenance doesn't seem particularly healthy. And you can see that he took that highly personal, because then he kind of goes back. He attacks back in what he says later in the letters. That the people saying that basically don't know what they're talking about. He takes it as a personal attack and attacks back. And we even do see that with Jesus in some of the sarcastic responses, like, have you not read this and this and this? That he asks people who've studied the law their entire life, well, haven't you read what the law says? Like, he kind of gets a little bit sassy with them. And I was talking with my dad, actually, and the example he gave of this when we were talking is the Kardashians. That we see that the Kardashians have a very public work life. That their work is being on TV. And because they happen to have a more public work life, I think the criticism we feel is a bit of a problem. I've heard people talk about the Kardashians being stupid. I've heard a variety of the Kardashians, and that because their work life is very public, it's okay for them to be dismissed and attacked, because we see that as, well, that's just what they do for a living. We feel like it's okay to say anything we want about them, because we don't expect anything we say to really hurt. And now I'm going to get in deep, and we're going for it. I'm going to talk about politics this election year.
Wow.
Super exciting. Everybody wants to hear more of that. But I think we've gotten to a point where we see politicians as having a very public work life, and that pretty much anything in their work and a fair amount of their personal life is there for us to see. And I think because we kind of idealize this separation between who a person is and a person's work life, we feel like we can make whatever attacks we want on the work life, and it won't affect the person, at least not in any serious way. People criticize my work. It affects me. I've had a couple teachers recently who talked about how I don't see you as the grade I give you on a paper. That you are worth more than whatever grades you get on a paper. And what I think of you as a person and what I think of you as a professional is not all wrapped up in how you did on this assignment. And it's always kind of nice to hear that, because when I don't hear it, I forget it. And I find that if I do bad in a class or do bad on a paper, I kind of I make assumptions on what that professor thinks of me. And I make assumptions that that professor thinks poorly of me, thinks I'm incompetent, thinks I don't work hard, thinks I'm not trying, thinks I'm stupid. I make assumptions on this professor's whole worldview of me based on the number of points I get on a paper and the comments therein. And I know in theory that that's not exactly right. That, first of all, I don't know what anybody's thinking, but second of all, that my whole existence does not boil down to a grade on a paper. But it's easy to forget that. And so I think when our work is criticized, we feel like it's personal. But I know it's easy, myself very much included, when we criticize other people's work, to feel like it's not personal. That they shouldn't take it personal. Because I'm not criticizing you, I'm just criticizing your work. Or I'm not attacking you as a person, I'm just attacking your idea. When it happens to us, it's personal. When we do it to other people, it's not personal. And I think one of the things I've noticed this election cycle with myself, very, very much included, is this tendency to attack as much as we want and assume that the attacks aren't going to do anything, aren't going to hurt anybody as people. And so with that, I saw a quote from Stephen Colbert, actually, and I was watching a video of his, and he talked about how in this election cycle, a lot of people are really relieved that it's over, because it's been brutal. It's been horrible, and nobody trusts each other. And with the caveat that I believe that both and every side have some legitimate reasons to be afraid this election cycle, and that a lot of the fears people have for their country and for the people in it are legitimate. I think the way we go about approaching these fears by attacking others is maybe a little bit less legitimate. So the quote that I saw was Colbert talking about, so how did our politics get so poisonous? I think it's because we overdosed, especially this year. We drank too much of the poison. You take a little bit of it so that you can hate the other side, and it tastes kind of good, and you like how it feels. And there's a gentle high to the condemnation, and you know you're right. And when I heard that said, I thought a lot about the way I privately have been thinking about this election cycle. And how I think there is kind of this gentle high we get to condemning others. I was talking with my mom about this, and she mentioned that she didn't think it was so different how we've become about politics than how a lot of us have been in the past about religion. How our religion was something that was very black and white, very fundamental, very us and them. Very much, we are the Christians and this is what we do and we're so good at it, and you guys, you're a little bit on shifty ground here. You guys, we'll see. That you might be good people, but you're not as good at people because you believe different and because you don't do what we do. and we do it this way. And if you really were enlightened, you would do it this way too. I think this election cycle, not all of us, but I think a lot of people, and I know I've fallen into this myself, have adopted that attitude of, well, if you could understand this a little bit more, you'd agree with me. And I don't think that's healthy. I don't think it's good for us to feel so sure of being right all the time. And I really know it's not healthy for us to be so sure of other people being wrong.
Superiority.
Yeah.
Superior.
And I think this election cycle in particular, it's the first election cycle that I personally have gotten really into. I'm old enough to vote, I've got kind of the resources, I got really excited, and it was fun. And it was not fun. It was somehow really fun and really not fun, because it was really fun when it was all happening, and I had that gentle high of condemnation. But it was really not fun when I had to think about what that meant for me as a person and whether it was actually good for me. And I think it's good to be informed in politics. It's good to have discussions. It's good to care. And it's good to care about our nation and the people in it. But I think when we're rejoicing in how right we are, and we're rejoicing in being able to prove other people wrong, I think that's a good indicator that we've drifted away from the good intentions and drank a little bit too much of the poison. And I think we don't think people's ideas, attacks on other people's ideas are personal. We don't think attacks on other people's politics are personal. We don't think attacks on other people's work, especially if it's a public kind of work, is personal. We don't expect anything that we say or think or do to really hurt anybody. And yet, when it's said or thought or done towards us, it hurts. And so I think one of the challenges for me these next couple forever long is going to be to try and balance back a little bit and come a little bit closer to this first century Mediterranean idea, where I recognize that yes, it's nice to have some separation from your ideas and some separation from your work and your actions, that no single thing of that defines you. They're more intertwined than we like to believe. And that convincing myself that I'm not going to hurt anybody because I'm not attacking them as a person, I'm attacking their thoughts or their ideas or their beliefs or their anything. I think it would do me well, at least, to recognize that your work and your ideas are more intertwined to your personhood than I've been showing the last couple of months in particular. And so I think that's kind of what struck me the most through working through this is it does to me and it does to everybody else too. And that it's going to have an effect and it's going to matter. And with that, the idea, kind of to wrap up broadly, that looking at trying to be careful in mistakes, that not using the things that I do well to cover up my mistakes, kind of looking at trying to find just a general balance between the extreme of the first century Mediterranean culture and the extreme of our culture, and trying to grow through that balance. So let's pray. Our Father, who's in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.